got some simple principles here. I'm going to talk about some today. This is sort of a hodgepodge of things, and I got a new chair, by the way, and it sits a little higher than my other one, so that's what these words are you see on my headrest. The thing I noticed, this was a peculiar little funny one here that I had on a Pontiac, Montana. You see that gauge waggling around there? I mean, it had 151,000 miles on it, but she said that this temperature gauge was just moving all over the place. And so I managed to take a little video of that, and I sped it up a little bit so you could see what it was doing. Now, this thing right here, I will tell you that tracking this thing through the Moto Logic to figure out exactly how the signal makes it to that temperature gauge on the instrument cluster, it'll typically be a class 2 signal line on these GM vehicles. But the engine coolant temperature sensor here is going to be networked over to the instrument cluster typically. Sometimes on some of them I think it goes through the body computer or something. I lose track of all that. Whenever you're fooling with one of those, you got to try to just do it, focus on that particular vehicle and its schematic and all. This particular one though, we replaced the engine coolant temperature sensor on the engine and it took care of it. It surprised me that with the readings moving around like they were, that it wasn't causing issues with idle quality and other kind of things. But we put an engine coolant temperature sensor on it and it settled that gauge right on down. Now on some of your General Motors, your pickup trucks, your 00 series pickups, like between like 2005 and 2014 or whatever, you get those little kits that you can even order them off Amazon where you replace the little stepper motors on those needles. That drive those needles and everything, and that is absolutely a fun repair. Doesn't cost a lot to buy the stuff to do it. You have to have a little bit of understanding about it. There's all kinds of YouTube videos where somebody will do that and show you how they did it. But you have to be something of a hand with a soldering iron, or you can get in trouble. Sometimes you can get different color instrument cluster lights to put in those things and all kinds of stuff. It's cool as all get out, and this is really kind of fun. But this wasn't a problem with the cluster as much as it was with the sensor that was actually at the source of it. Now, this is a little story I wanted to talk about here. You see how that fan is? You see where the fan shroud is, or where the fan is split in the middle right there? Let me back up and tell you a little bit about this. There was a late 80s Ranger that belonged to an airline pilot, and this was basically a long time after that Ranger was new. It wasn't a new vehicle by any means, but he'd driven it for years. And he didn't want a really nice vehicle parked at the airport while he was flying his plane, and so he got this old Ranger and he would drive it. And this thing, it had a V6 in it, and can't remember if it was a 3 liter or 4 liter, what it was or what year. Well, it would have been a 3 liter, or a 2.9, not a 3 liter. In that particular year model Ranger, because the 2.9s were what was coming in those Rangers back in the 80s. The 2.9 is like the 4.0 overhead valve, but it's it's the same basic engine as that. The 3 liter is a different engine from the 2.9, and then there was the 2.8 that they had with the carburetors on them back before they put fuel injection on those Rangers. But the point is, this one here, as I remember, had a 2.9 in it, and this thing was trying to overheat. We did all kinds of stuff trying to figure out what was making this vehicle overheat. We worked on it. We actually measured the temperature at each one of the expansion plugs on the end of the cylinder head to see where the heat was starting to build up. We did water pump stuff, circulate. Just anything you could possibly imagine. The cooling system was clean, but it kept trying to overheat. And finally, the guy said, is it possible that we could put a bigger radiator in? Well, I did. This was a pretty sharp cookie, this guy that was this pilot, and he wasn't complaining about the bill or anything. We were just busting our fanny trying to figure out what was making this thing overheat. And so he went to, and didn't have any blown head gaskets either. There was none of that kind of stuff going on. But he says, maybe we could put a bigger radiator on it. So I found out that an Explorer radiator at that point in time which the Explorers were coming out. This was like I think this was like an 88 model or 89 model, but the Explorer radiator that was in the newest Explorers that were coming out, came out in 91, 93, 94, that series would fit right in that Ranger, as I remember, and they were a lot thicker radiators. They had more flues in them. And so we got one of those radiators and we put it in there, and the of course, that moved the radiator fan shroud back so that the fan was kind of up inside the shroud instead of split in the middle like the one you see right here. That's looking down from the top, obviously. And so the thing, it acted different, but it was still trying to overheat, and that was troubling. And so what we decided to do was to go ahead and take the shop foreman. There was some vans that Ford made that were trying to overheat because this radiator shroud was back here instead of here. I mean, it was basically too far back, and the fan needs to split the middle on the belt-driven fans. And so what I did was I took that fan shroud off and I marked it about 1.25 inches back from the edge of it and put masking tape around it so I could cut it straight. And using my high-speed cutter, I cut about 1.25 inches off of that fan shroud because the thicker radiator, you know, had moved it back. And when I did that and I got that piece of that shroud off of there and I put that back on there, split in the middle like that right there, well, that fan, that thing ran cool as a cucumber. Why that was necessary, I don't know, unless there was something wrong with the original radiator that we could not see because we didn't cut into the original radiator and look at it. But, you know, and when we put the thicker radiator on there, it got us kind of gerrymandered up because we made another change when we made it, you know, swallowing up the fan. But anyway, after that, that thing was just as cool as it could be, and he drove it, was really happy for a long time. Spent a pretty good bit of money, you know, by the time the dealership, he wound up paying for a radiator and all that stuff. But he wasn't complaining about the bill. He just wanted the truck would run cool so he could drive it to the airport and park it out there, and it would be a crappy looking truck. You know, sometimes when I'm carrying my laptop, I carry it in a really crappy looking bag when I go to a convention or something. So if you got a crappy looking bag, they're going to feel like you probably don't have a very good laptop either. You know, it's sort of a camouflage thing. All right, don't forget this though when you're looking at overheating issues. It's really, really smart, and I've mentioned this before. You cannot see this unless you take the radiator loose and you move it back away from the AC condenser. That stuff will go right through the AC condenser, and not a single bit of it will stop on the AC condenser, and it will get stopped by the radiator, and it will clog up in between there. I don't know how many times on these farmers' trucks around here that I've had one that was overheating, and I've either just externally washed the radiator after cleaning all of this trash out and had it just cool right on down, just like it was supposed to. It's amazing how all of that stuff can make it all the way through that AC condenser, and it'll fool you looking at the AC condenser into thinking that there's nothing in the radiator. But boy, if you pull that thing back and you look down at that radiator, or maybe get your borescope or whatever to look it down in there, you'll be surprised sometimes how much of that crud. Now, you've also got to think about where the vehicle has been and how they've used it, and if they've done a lot of driving through the fields on it and all, like the farmers do and all that, chasing their cows and all, you're going to wind up with a situation like that. All right, this right here was a little white road boss story that I had over there. I mentioned it one time before, but we had a couple of these white road boss 1.5 ton, deuce and a half semis down there when I was working in Texas. And I was probably 21, 22 years old at the time, but I was something of a shop foreman. I had a purchase order book and that kind of thing. But all of these older guys were always telling me, you know, you can't do this, you can't do that. You know, some of these guys were just truck drivers, some were electricians, some were welders and all that kind of stuff. But because I was younger than every one of them, they always felt like they were a little bit wiser than they did. And all they had to do to get me to try to do something was say, you can't do this. You know, one time I was, my immediate supervisor was in charge of the cranes and the pipe loaders and the forklifts and the cars and the trucks, and I basically handled the lighter work on the pipe loaders, if you could say there was any light work on them, and also the forklifts and the cars and the trucks and that kind of thing. I didn't do any work on the cranes because I didn't like cranes. I mean, I've worked on cranes, but I didn't care nothing about fooling with cranes. Not my favorite kind of work, but one way or another, this CY60 forklift that we had, it was an old Clark CY60, and the power steering pump was built on the back end of the generator. Now this one's old enough to have an actual generator, not an alternator on it. And the seals in that power steering pump kept leaking. Even when we put seals in there, I don't know if the shaft had a little mark on it or was brindled or something. But anyway, we would wind up oil would get into the generator, and the generator would stop putting out because the oil would foul the brushes and all that kind of stuff. And I told my supervisor, I said, I'm going to put an alternator on this thing. This is ridiculous. I mean, we keep having to pull this thing out reseal that darn thing and, you know, get the generator cleaned out and rebuilt and all that. So I said, why don't we go ahead? He said, oh, it can't be done. You know, don't you tell me it can't be done. You know, I got an alternator. I got a circle burner on the torch. I built a bracket with a curved slot in it. Mounted that thing on there, put another belt on it. You know, a belt with a different pulley. I don't remember exactly how I did the belt driving part of it, or maybe got a longer belt one around the existing. One way or another, I put an alternator on that thing with a regular external voltage regulator mounted over there to the side. And that thing worked just so perfect. There was no comparison. And we just, at that point, we just let the generator stay on there to drive the power steering pump. So we'd still have power steering, and a little bit of a leak wouldn't matter. You know, because it didn't take much of an oil leak into that generator before it stopped. Well, anyway, some of these smart aleck truck drivers, they had a shifter kind of like this on here with these air valves on it. And they've got this big, fancy, fine Hurst shifter, and it was a big, ugly, stupid looking thing, and it still had the air valves on it, mounted on it some kind of way, and they wanted to put that on there. But rather than just being right on top of the shift rod, which had a 5/8 thread up in here, they put that big old thing on there with all that jerking that thing around. They broke that threaded rod off the top of that shifter. And so the thing came in there and they said, well, this rod broke off the shifter. What are we going to do? And you know, I was sitting up in the truck looking at it, and one of them says you're going to have to replace that shifter. And I says, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, I said, I might be able to fix this one here. They said, there's no way you can fix that shifter there. The threaded part broke off of it. And it was like a 3/4 inch or slightly bigger shift rod, and it had been machined down to that 5/8 U.S. standard coarse thread. And so I said, what if I was to file this thing off flat where it broke, center punch it, and make a little pilot hole, and go down in there with a drill, and then tap some 5/8 threads in there, and use a piece of threaded rod long enough to where I could actually replace the threaded part on top, so the shifter would screw right back onto it. They says, you're still going to have to pull the shifter off and do that with the drill press. There's no way you're going to be able to do it in the truck. Well, I was going to show those people that I was, you know, I didn't have anything to lose whatsoever. So I got up in the seat with that 1/2 inch drill, and I center punched that thing really good and solid, and I wrapped my leg around it to hold it still, and I held that big old 1/2 inch drill and drilled down in that thing. And that's how it was broke off like that. And I drilled down in there, and I made that little place right there. And then I, you know, got the tap, and I basically, well, I'm sorry, I tapped it. I drilled down in there, and then I tapped it with this tap. And then I screwed that piece down in there, and I made that shifter look just like that again. And I fixed that thing. That truck was back on the road in 25 minutes. They couldn't believe it. You know, they felt like we've got to order parts and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, here's the other thing. If you're fixing something in a situation so that it doesn't matter, you know what I'm saying? If it doesn't matter, if you got nothing to lose, that's the point. One time on one of the big trucks we had a Lodestar 1850 gas burner, and you know how the ring gear on these big manual transmission vehicles is basically you put it on the flywheel kind of like a blacksmith used to put the tire on a wagon wheel. You heat it up and you let it settle into place. In other words, you're going to have the flywheel laying flat. You're going to lay the ring gear up there, and you keep heating it with a torch until it gets big enough to where it drops into place, and then you let it cool off and it grabs the flywheel. Well, this one here, for some strange reason, had decided to let go of the flywheel, and it would the starter would spin the ring gear on the flywheel. It would like that. And so I told my supervisor, he said, we're going to have to pull that transmission out of there. And I'd pulled the transmission out a bunch of times, and I wasn't afraid to do that. But I told him, I said, we don't have to pull the transmission out. I said, all we have to do is I can get up under there with a welding machine, and I can basically put about maybe a 1/2 inch weld in about 5 or 6 places around that thing, and it will work just as well. And he says, well, no, but it might crack right there where you weld it or something. And I says, what do we have to lose? If I weld it and it doesn't work, all we've wasted is a 6011 rod. And I says, if I weld it and it works, then we've got the truck back on the road and doing its work really fast, and we hadn't had to pull the transmission out. So he finally agreed to that. He was a little hard-headed and kind of wanted, if it wasn't his idea, it was a bad idea. Have you ever worked under somebody like that? But anyway, I got in there and I welded that thing in about 5 or 6 places around there, and it worked perfectly for the rest of the time we had it. No problem. What did you have to lose anyway? You know, so, all right, here we're going to go. Cylinder number 2 misfire detected on this particular one here. This was an Asian car. It may have been a Nissan Maxima. I'm not sure. I absolutely cannot remember. But I got the Pico scope that we had over there at the time, and I went ahead and got this screwball scope pattern. See how crazy that thing looks. And I've seen, whenever I was using a plain old scope, you know, back when in the CRT scope days, if I saw one like that, I always assumed there was something bad with the spark plug going on. And so we'll pull the plug out. Look at that. We had that thing scorched all the way down the side. When the plugs get where there's too much resistance, that spark's going to look for somewhere else to go. And this one here arced down the side of the plug and all that. And so we managed to take care of that. But there's that Pico scope pattern that I got right there. That was a pretty cool little picture I pulled out of my archives. Now, I saw this beside the road last week when I was driving over to the sound down south of here. And I had to make a trip down there, and I saw this, looks like a 67, maybe a 68 model Chevy C10 sitting there. And it's still got tires on it and all that, but it's sitting in the weeds, and you can tell it hadn't run in a while. And I'm thinking, what would this truck need to get it going? You know, if you pulled in there and told them you wanted to buy the truck, you know, they just say, no, it ain't for sale. It was my daddy's truck, and I'm going to keep it until it rots or something like that. But I'm not in the mood to do any sort of rebuilding on trucks anyway. Right after I took that job at the college teaching auto mechanics, I had 2 guys that I hadn't heard from in over 20 years that contacted me and asked me if I would rebuild old pickups, kind of like this one right here. 2 different guys. And both of them were calling me to ask me if I would do this. No, this is not a hobby shop. We're not going to rebuild old cars. We're basically going to be doing teaching them how to work on the cars of today, late 60s vehicles. They're interesting to work on, but they're not going to benefit a whole lot from that. And so I like for the students to have something to do that they can learn more from than working on something that's old. Later on, we did do a little bit of work on some older cars, but I wasn't going to get that started because you can fill your whole lot up with people wanting old cars worked on. Now this right here is one of the several ways head gaskets have failed. This was on my Jeep Cherokee, and this one here, whenever I drive it from here, from where I was teaching over there, 30 miles, and I'd stop here, and I'd wind up going to Winn-Dixie to get me some bananas, and when I come out and crank it up, it would go bup, 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 and it would flash a check engine light, and then it would clear up. And it turned out that cylinder number 3, which is fairly common on those 4-liter Jeeps, was getting coolant. And this crusty stuff you see here is coolant that has crusted up and dried on top of the piston. And it was basically weeping its way from this coolant passage past the fire ring into the cylinder. Now, again, there was no combustion getting into the coolant, but there was coolant getting into here. And that is more common than you know. When people talk about blown head gaskets, they want to try to talk about it. Well, if I got a blown head gasket, I'll have water in the wall. I don't know. That is so rare. I don't even know on most of them how that could even happen. But in this particular case, that one there caused a misfire. And you know what I told you what I do with a misfire? When I've got a misfire like that, I crank it up, and while it's still skipping, I shut it off. I pull all the plugs out, and I see one of them that's steaming. I know that there's coolant getting into that cylinder. Or if I see one that's got crusty green deposits on it, it's the same color, as a dried antifreeze would be. All right, here's another way it can leak, a pressurized oil passage. All of the vehicles, engines that have overhead camshafts in the head have to have pressurized lube oil going to the cam bearings, and they're going to have a pressurized oil passage going through. This is on a 98 Dodge Stratus. This particular one, the reason that head gasket had to be replaced was because this thing was leaking a lot of oil right in this area. It was running down the bottom, dripping off the bell housing. They thought at a shop down in Florida somewhere where they took it to that it had a rear main seal because of it was dripping off the engine down there at the lowest place where it always will, even if it's leaking above there. We put dye in it and found that. But anyway, this right here was where it was leaking, and that's the oil passage right there. Now this one right here is another way it can leak. You can blow between 2 cylinders. You'll have low compression on 2 cylinders. Usually have misfires on 2 cylinders. And you may have some popping going on in the intake or something like that, or in the exhaust. But whenever you measure the compression, you got 2 adjacent cylinders that have low compression. You're going to be looking for a situation like this. That fire ring failed between one fire ring failed, and then it burned through the other one, and all that. The fire ring is the part around that cylinder head gasket that's supposed to contain that combustion whenever it happens. And this right here is when you're getting combustion into the cooling system, and it'll overheat it really, really fast. I had often told my students that if you suspect a problem like this, that was pretty doggone bad there, the one that you saw puffing. But if you suspect that you may have a problem, let the vehicle sit there until it's completely cold, it's been sitting all night or whatever, and then go out there and with the radiator cap on it, and fire that thing up. There's a couple of ways you can do this. Fire it up, let it run about 60 to 90 seconds, switch it off. If you take that cap off, then you hear it going when you take the cap off. You know it built pressure in there a lot faster than it should. Because the reason pressure builds into your cooling system anyway is because the temperature and the coolant expanding and all that. It shouldn't heat that thing up and build pressure in there within 60 to 90 seconds of running on a cold engine that's been sitting all night. What some guys like to do is they'll like to take something like a rubber glove, like a natural glove, and either tie wrap it or rubber band it right there around the radiator filler neck. And when you start it up, watch that rubber glove, and if you see it, puffing, or if you see it inflating, really quick right after you start the engine when it was cold before, or even when it wasn't cold, if you see it beginning to inflate really fast, you'll know that there's combustion going in there. There's tools you can buy that you can put this liquid in there and you watch it to change color and all that kind of hogwash, or you can get an exhaust gas analyzer and sniff in there and see if you find anything. But anyway, what I always like to do, if I would spin it over like that and I saw it go puff, 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 one part of the cylinder. Now if you pull the spark plugs one at a time, or pull all but one of them and leave that one in there with it completely full of coolant, you spin it over. If it disturbs the water, you'll know the only one with a spark plug in it is the one that's actually got the breach. Now if you pull that plug out and put it in the next hole and you keep working your way down there, you can find the place before you ever tear it down which cylinder it is that's causing that. Of course, looking at the plug helps too, This right here is differential backlash patterns. This is the load side of the tooth, and this is what it's supposed to look like. You're going to paint this compound on there, and you're going to turn it through, and you're going to make sure that you're turning it the way so that you'll have good contact on the drive side of the tooth, which is the bellied out side of the tooth is the side where this loaded when you're going forward, okay? This is the load side of the tooth, and this is laying over sideways like these are. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to look if it's set up right. Okay, now if you don't have enough backlash, you're going to see a pattern that's down here like this. If you got too much backlash, you'll see it like that. There's some other ones for pinion depth and this kind of thing. I could have shown you a whole bunch of these patterns. We'll save that for another video. This is the proper backlash with the engine heavily loaded. But that's what you're going to see right there. You just paint it basically with some kind of white grease or something, or maybe just plain old paint, but you got to turn it through if you're using paint so that before the paint gets dry you can see what kind of pattern you had on your gears. And basically if you don't do this, you're going to have singing, whining gears, and if you drive them until it mismatches the gears, they're never going to stop singing and whining. Alright, now look at these plastic covers and shields. You got a shield over the throttle. If you're one of these guys like me and it doesn't have electronic throttle body, and you like to pull on that throttle and rev it up, that's annoying because it's hard to get around it without taking it off of there. Alright, but they put this cover over there, and then they put a cover on the battery too. Now what the heck is that about? Also, you got this breather here. If you see this breather cracked or broke or something like that, don't try to fix it with duct tape. Replace the breather, or you're going to wind up getting a lot of dust and dirt up in here to destroying your engine. Well, what this is a snow shield. You would not believe, if you're not from that part of the country, how much snow gets through the grill and under the engine compartment, and can actually, if you don't have the snow shield on it, it can hold that throttle open and you can let off the gas and find out you're still driving down the road. PCV system likes to ice up sometimes in places like that. The throttle body sometimes will ice up because of cold moisture coming. That's why a lot of your throttle bodies will have hot water lines circulating through the throttle body to prevent the throttle from sticking open. The battery cover is to keep the battery from getting quite so hot due to engine heat. Some of the Explorers that we had whenever they first started building the Ford Explorer back in the early, I'm talking about the SUV, not some of the old pickups where they call it Explorer, so they own that name, but the SUVs would come in there and we'd have to put battery boxes on them under some sort of a recall program thing. And because part of the problem we were having with the Explorers was that batteries were boiling and they were making a big mess out of everything. And so what we would have to do is get those batteries covers that they'd send, and we'd put those battery covers on there to prevent the battery from getting too hot and mitigate that boiling electrolyte situation in the battery. And we had a service manager one time, and we would always, some of you guys that are familiar with the Ford thing, they have this Oasis online automotive service information system, and you put your serial number into the car and it prints out the warranty work that's been done, and it prints out any recalls it has on it or anything like that. And every single ticket that the service writers wrote, they had to run one of these on it. They had to pull it up on their machine, they had it set up, and they would print that out. And if there was a recall on that recall or some kind of a program on there, recalls and programs, two different things. Programs expire with time and mileage, but recalls are good forever. But anyway, this recall program said we had to put a battery box on these Explorers. And he was trying to incentivize these service writers not to miss those recalls. And so he says, he told everybody, he had a big meeting in the shop, and he told the service writers and all the mechanics, he says, if you draw a ticket and there is a recall on that Oasis printout that comes with that ticket, then what you need to do is go to the service writer and tell him to point out where you missed the recall and didn't make a ticket, and then he has to give you $1. Now that sounds real good, but he couldn't force anybody to give us $1, But there was this one guy that was a real crisp, solid kind of a service writer, and he didn't make all that many mistakes, but sometimes he got in too much of a hurry, And I went up there and I said, you missed a recall on this Explorer. And he goes, no. He put a cigarette in his mouth. He goes, no, wait a minute, I got it here somewhere. It's already been done. And he kept digging and looking, and he goes, no. And I said, you can just stop looking because you're not going to find it. And he goes, well, how do you know if I've got all the paperwork out here? I said, because it ain't got no battery box on it. You can just look at it and tell it hadn't been done. And he said, ooh, busted. Did he give me $1? No, he did not. Didn't matter, we got it done anyway. But that's what, if you're wondering about the little bubble wrap that's around some batteries and the covers that's on them and all that, you're thinking this plastic stuff is just plastic. Just because it's plastic doesn't mean it's worthless, because it's got a job to do. Now think about this. If they're building 500,000 cars and each one of these shields cost $1, they spent $500,000 on that snow shield. Now think about that for a minute. Now if you're not going to put it back on there, then you're basically doing something that's going to change it. Imagine this. Imagine you leave it off. They drive it up north. The throttle freezes open, and they crash and burn, and they find out you left the snow shield off. Think about how that's going to play out. Of course, the battery cover needs to be put back on there too. You don't need to leave that off. Well, the brake line union done right, you'll use one of these you'll double flare the lines and have the right kind of little nuts here to put it on there. Screw that down in there on both sides. That's the right way to fix a brake line. This is the wrong way to do this. This is a copper tubing union. It's okay for, fuel line that doesn't have a lot of pressure on it. These lines are going to have as much as 2,000 pounds of fluid pressure on them, and your brakes totally depend on them things staying there. That's why you need to fix these right. Do not use a copper tubing union on there. You may get away with it a time or two, but sooner or later it's going to bite you. Do not go here. Don't use the copper tubing union with a little ferrule to fix brake lines. As easy as that is, it's a bad idea. I used an old bucket that I put a label on, used up brake pads only, and we would throw brake pads in there. And of course I'd say used up brake pads only. Look here, somebody put some tire weights in there. Whenever you stick them sticky tire weights on there, and then you got to pull them back off when you're trying to get the tire to balance and all. Somebody threw a bunch of those in there. I thought this was like scrap metal. And I would actually put these, there was a scrap iron bin over there, and that's where I'd put the brake pads. I didn't just want to throw them in the trash, but that bucket took a while to fill up, but not really all that long if you do a lot of brake jobs. This is a handprint syndrome. Don't be this guy. One of the things I used to tell my guys, you can torque every bolt, you can do everything right, you can double check all of the mechanical stuff, you can make everything else just exactly like it's supposed to be, but if a customer, and some customers are worse than others about this, but if a customer sees one half of a dirty thumbprint on their steering wheel or on one of their fenders, they're infuriated, and you're a sorry mechanic if they'll never bring their vehicle to you again. So it's always a good idea to use fender covers and to keep the thing cleaned up. And some of these vehicles that we used to get in there would be those super shiny Mustangs. And boy, if you put any kind of a little scratch or anything on their paint, some of those people would get apoplectic on you. But you need to be taking care of that thing and not leave the dirty handprints on there. I took a picture of that because somebody got through with a customer's car, one of the students did, and they left dirty handprints all over it like that. And I got really tickled at one of these guys that runs a local body shop. He was a piece of work. And kind of loudmouth. He did that. Their shop does fairly good body work and all. But I went over one day to talk to him about something. And you know, you can see somebody that's kind of full of themselves like this. And when I pulled up out there waiting to talk to him, he was out in front, and he was looking at this vehicle he had just finished working on, and he told the one of his people that were out there, one of his porters or something, that was supposed to bring the car around and make sure that everything was all right on it. He was telling that guy, he says, "Get this stuff off of the fender over here." He says, "We're not going to treat our customers like that. You know how I am." And I was thinking, you know how I am? Really? You know, he was making it all about him. But this is when you got to take a picture. I saw this beautiful old 64, 65 Chevy pickup. They looked pretty much the same from 64 to 66. You know, it's a little bit difficult to tell those apart. But that one right there is super factory. I love the way the spare was mounted there, the old step side thing. And those little original hubcaps and all that. I owned two pickups about this same year model. And you know, it's those vehicles you think if I had kept that and painted it and fixed it up, I could have kept that thing running and had made this something that was really special. These pickups were all over the place whenever I was a boy growing up. And I bought the one I bought had a flat tire on the left front. It was white, and I only paid $150 for it. But at the time I bought it, it was only like 9 or 10 years old or something like that. And it needed a battery and it had a flat tire, and that's all that was wrong with it. And I bought that truck. You notice the gas tank is in the cab behind the seat, which is, you know, not really such a good idea. But beautiful truck. This one here was when somebody gave up on stealing the catalytic converter. They got in their vehicle one day and suddenly they had an exhaust noise that they didn't have before. And when they brought it over there, somebody had tried to cut the catalytic converter off of it and gave up on it and just left it all screwed up under there. You know, so we had to take care of this problem. It seemed like, as I remember, we basically fixed that with a coat hanger torch. You know, welded it up like that and stopped up that leak and all. But one way or another, that was a nasty business right there when they whacked that thing off. This right here was a headlight upgrade. I don't even remember what kind of lights we were putting in there, but when we changed out this light, we turned it on and compared it to that one. Man, there was no difference. This one here was a different kind of bulb. I think it's one of them fancy brighter bulbs that makes you so irritated when you meet one at night going along there. Now this is something my dad taught me in the 1960s. There's these bearing packers you can buy, and we were required to have one as for an ATEF tool. But he basically was showing me how you, and I didn't use gloves when I was working with my dad, but you put that grease on there, and whenever you keep cutting a little bit of that grease away, it squishes up through the top of it, and you go all the way around, and you basically got that thing completely packed with grease. Now, one of the things that I thought was very interesting was back in that place where I'm putting that grease down in there. Back whenever I was working at the Mazda dealer, we would do these 30,000 mile services on these Mazda RX-7s. They had front wheel bearings like these, and we were supposed to pack those front wheel bearings. And I would pull those, the rotor off, you know, and then they would have, and get the bearings laid out on a rag here, there would have so much grease packed down in here between the bearings that, I mean, I'm telling you, it was like a huge handful of the grease that they packed in the factory, and they just packed so much of it in there. I guess they felt like if the bearings heated up, the grease would run in there and help grease those bearings again. I don't know. But that grease was brand new and had never been touched on those Mazda RX-7s. There was enough of that brand new grease that I could scoop that out of there on my hands and actually repack the bearings with the grease that came when it was brand new with the car. But it was just totally astonishing how much grease they would pack between the inner and outer bearings on those RX-7s. I was replacing the rotor on that one right there. And you know, this is the red grease, that's the brown grease, you know, whatever you like to use. Now this right here was on my Explorer. I put the radiator in it because it started leaking, several years ago. And I kept having problems with this transmission fluid leaking around here. Look at that distorted O-ring. Somehow the O-ring got cut. And it was difficult to figure out why it was leaking. And it's also difficult to replace that doggone O-ring too. Because you got to dig around up in that hole. And you got to get one exactly the right size. You got to work it back in there and all that kind of thing. But I got, from Advanced Auto Parts, I wound up going through 2 radiators. And they either leaked coolant, even though I finally got this straightened out. So I wound up having to go back and I finally wound up putting a Ford radiator on that thing, and it's not leaking right now, so that should be okay. Now, when the radiator cap fails, I used to see these. You pull the radiator cap off. If that's dangling right there, then that means air is going to just come and go as it pleases, and you don't really like that. Or I mean, actually, the coolant, when it expands and contracts, it'll be like you don't even have a radiator cap on it. This is actually supposed to seal. It's got a spring, you notice right here, that's this piece right here. It's supposed to seal, and whenever the coolant contracts and goes down, it's supposed to pull whatever coolant's in the surge tank out of that little drinking straw hose that's underneath the coolant. It's supposed to pull that back in there and make sure that the coolant level always stays up. But that little thing right there, if you pull it off and it's dangling, then that right there, I see that as a bad cap. Well, the problem I had was some of the stent radiator caps I would get from the parts store, on the card before you even pulled them off, would have a dangly valve like that. And I'd say, I don't want one with a dangly valve. That's why I'm replacing the one I got on here right here. And so what I did was I would say, send me another one. So they would send me another one that was exactly the same part number, and the valve wouldn't be dangling on that one. It would dangle on some of them, and some of them it wouldn't. And so the tale that I was told by the parts guy that called the stent representative, the guy says, well, we build our caps like that with the dangly when it's brand new to prevent it from causing pressure to build up too fast and bust hoses. And I thought, that doesn't even make any sense. If any of you guys are familiar with a situation like that, I wish you'd educate me on that, because I'm having a little bit of an issue. And I was frequently telling them that I did not like having one with a dangly. When I get it off the card brand new or out of the box or whatever, I don't want no dangly end on it like that. Because that spring right there is supposed to hold that up. And then it's a weak spring. You can grab this thing and pull it real easy and all that, but I'm always looking at that. It better not dangle whenever I'm looking at that cap. Well, it's time for me to go, and I just really appreciate you guys coming by, and I reckon I'll be talking to y'all next time.